So as mentioned, as we transition into the rest of this morning, we're really going to be focusing on the FIPs process specifically, starting first with a high-level overview of the FIP0001v2 process changes, which is the Filecoin Foundation's coordination effort for improving the FIPs process. Then we will take a brief break, and when we come back, we will deep dive into two components of this in particular, with the goal really being just to have a conversation amongst those of us who are in the room. So I am on a stage, there are these very bright lights, but please, we want to have a conversation throughout all pieces of this, and I really welcome you to interject at any time, ask questions, contribute ideas, whatever it is that may come to mind for you. So without further ado, what is going on? What is it that we're trying to achieve? So I have worked for the Filecoin Foundation full-time on FIPs, reviewing them, editing them, processing them, maintaining the repo for about 2.5 years. And what we've seen in this period of time is really an incredible amount of community growth, lots of changes to the Filecoin tech stack itself, which then ushers in new needs for the governing process. We've seen the types of proposals that we're getting change. And we've also seen the types of contributors who are using this process and trying to interact with governance also shift. All of these shifts are good, right? They're indicative of a maturing and changing ecosystem. And our really central thesis for today is that as the project changes, it's our job as stewards to sort of be aware of these changes and adapt when it becomes necessary. So yes, we will go into detail, but I think some of the big things, as mentioned, we're seeing more people come in and try and use this process than ever before, right? When I first started, we had maybe a handful of people who were pretty consistently writing FIPs. We only had about 15 FIPs that had ever been accepted. We had very, very low engagement when it came to actually reviewing or editing from people who were not already assigned either as maintainers or others with write access into the repo. And now that is very, very different. We now have discussion posts where we're getting hundreds and hundreds of comments. Storage providers uniquely have been engaged in this process in a variety of different ways. And through this, we also have seen like a growing diversity in the people who are signaling that they want to write FIPs, even if right now they don't feel like they have a very clear access point for doing so. So I would say that broadly what we're seeing is a maturation in sort of the demand for governance as a core function of how this ecosystem is facilitating decision-making. And I think one of our primary goals is to observe this and say that it is necessary for us to scale up the FIPs process in such a way that it can accommodate this demand for change. I know that's still sort of high level, and we can dive into some of those more specifically if there's parts of that that are of interest to you. But for right now, does that answer your question? Nice. All right. So that being said, what is it that we're trying to do, right? Governance processes are tricky. There's a wide breadth of activity that goes into them. It's not just about saying yay or nay on public proposals. It's about deliberation and engagement and ensuring that you actually have quality contributions being made, assessed, and put into practice on chain. So our goal here is to really sort of holistically review what it is that's happening in the Filecoin ecosystem, to really understand how these changes are affecting people's ability to work and contribute to Filecoin, and to also keep in mind that at the same time we're doing this, this remains an active project, right? We want to be sure that we are addressing people's needs in a way that makes them better contributors, more able and more easily able to contribute to Filecoin without necessarily getting in their way, right? So with that being said, for those reasons, there are a few things that we are not trying to do. So we want to reform the FIPs process to make it more usable, but we do not presuppose in any way that we are going to have perfect solutions, right? It's in part why we're dedicating so much time to talking about this is because, again, governance is this very fundamental political problem of who gets what, when, and with what level of prioritization. And those are very hard questions to answer. Our goal is to have these conversations, to understand those pain points, and then transfer them into meaningful changes that help guide us in a better direction iteratively over time. Likewise, we do not want to start from scratch. The well of governance options and design choices is very, very deep, and Filecoin is an active project. Our goal is to implement changes that are comfortable, that we can help people onboard to, even as they're using this process. And we also want to be clear, too, that Filecoin is a really complicated project. And by thinking about governance and the way that we can improve it, we seek for this to be a really pragmatic way of enhancing people's ability to engage, and we don't really want to have sort of these really high-level conversations that fundamentally are at odds with what Filecoin was designed to do. Okay. So our goal to adapt the FIPs process with updated rules, processes, and tools that reflect the needs of the entire Filecoin community. That is the driving bottom line that we are aspiring to, and it's really what we want to frame all of our conversations around. Any questions so far? Comments? Cool. So where are we starting? How are we doing this? So for months, we've been talking about this, going around the world, actually, having community calls, going and speaking with core devs, having meetings at Phil events. And that's really where we're starting, with our knowledge of Filecoin and the people who are using it today. We are very lucky working at Filecoin, working with Protocol Labs, that we also have a deep expert base of folks who have decades of experience working in open source communities. And we also have pretty good knowledge of models that have been successfully piloted in other blockchain projects. And one of the things that I would like to stress, because I think this is very important for these kinds of governing challenges, is that we don't want to lean on one of these buckets over any other. We really want to consider all of them as input functions that can provide us really useful information when standing up new tools or processes. Again, governance is challenging because this is an active project people are using, and we want to make sure that we're not over-indexing too much on a singular model or an out-of-the-box solution that may have worked in other ecosystems. We really want to, again, take a holistic approach to understanding and building something that works specifically for Filecoin and its existing and near future users. So with that, sort of a first question for those of you who may have interacted with this process in the past. What key pain points are you currently experiencing that you think should be considered when we're implementing changes to the governance process? Any ideas? Has anyone in this room written a FIP? Yes? Would you be willing to talk about what was that experience like? And you can be honest, if it was challenging or frustrating, slower than you thought, faster than you thought. Thanks, Ian. Sorry to put you on the spot, but you raised your hand, so thank you.
No, my answer is going to be a little bit disappointing. I had no expectations, so that's it.
That's fair. Okay, no expectations. That's still useful. How was it to navigate the process, to write a draft, open a PR?
That was very easy because I have George next to me.
Okay.
I always ask him.
Yeah.
And that's instead of asking Google.
Ask George?
Yeah.
I think that's also a model we could all adopt. Yeah. Sorry, George.
Like Google, but Georgian.
Yeah, perfect.
I'm the new swagbots.
Anyone else? Since most of you have not written FIPs, have any of you ever needed to reference or read them? Galen? Yes? Read a FIP? Nice. Megan? Read a FIP? Nice. Has anyone ever been in a conversation, perhaps this week, where sort of the outcome or decision that people have arrived at is that, oh, we're going to write a FIP. And that's sort of the concluding next step, right? And then you have contributors who say, okay, great. And push it to folks like George, who've been around for a while or have interacted with this process before. But have you heard of spaces or places where writing a FIP is sort of the final result and that effort may or may not see the light of day? Has that ever been an experience that you've had? Yeah? Yeah. So with this being said, smaller room today, not a problem. However, we've gone around and I've bugged people about this for months, asking them the same question, okay? And what this has resulted in is a huge body of feedback, right? Actually, frankly, even before we've sought to make changes to this process, we've always gathered feedback from core devs, from FIP authors, from people engaging in this process, who have sort of been able to align around a couple of key systematic pain points that we haven't been able to find sort of temporary fixes for, right? And we organize them in these three buckets. One is this emerging idea that some FIPs are simply more complex than others, right? This is something that FIP editors in particular, the people who are responsible for editing and reviewing draft FIPs and pulling in experts also to ensure that FIPs are audited appropriately, have consistently come back to. That Sometimes we have FIPs for things like changing network data labels or making really small changes to data structures in the protocol layer. Sometimes we have FIPs that propose really complex cryptoeconomic changes, and the level of scrutiny and the level of expertise necessary to parse and engage with these texts is fundamentally different, right? For people working close to this process, this is also beginning to imply that some FIPs require more scrutiny than others, but also that the bar for acceptance and finalization for these FIPs is potentially off-kilter and isn't necessarily aligning with the complexity of the FIPs that we happen to be getting. The next one is that Filecoin is dynamic and tough decisions need to be made, right? This is very much a cultural indicator that we have gotten time and time again from folks who raise this challenge of wanting to be able to make adjustments to the protocol and changes to the Filecoin community, needing to be cautious about this, needing to take into account the fact that changes to the protocol layer affect a wide array of folks in ways that we can't always fully anticipate, but also knowing that Filecoin is growing and maturing and trying to compete against a very, very different type of product class than a lot of blockchain projects aspire to. And for that reason, we have accepted the changeability of Filecoin and need an appropriate way to assess and manage that expectation. And the last one, a little bit more local, is that core devs should not be put in the middle. This community is developing. There are more and more experts coming in every single day. And what we've continually tried to do is to lean on this body of technical reviewers to ask them to intercede on governance issues that have been really difficult for the community broadly to navigate. This is a role that core devs do not want. It is a role that I personally, as a core dev, do not believe they should have. And it's one that we constantly come back to. We've begun to lean on this group of people for more than they should be required to provide. So we want to make sure we can find ways to not only change that, but actually understand what it is that's causing that pressure and systematically improve whatever it is so that we can actually add capacity for the community itself to be weighing into these conversations and into these decision-making spaces with greater efficacy. Okay? So where we've landed, again, months of conversations, I've reduced it to 3 bullets, 4 sub-bullets. And what we've got is that the FIPS process should be updated with consensus pathways, right, the point of decision-making, and also mechanisms, the tools that get us there, that align with the complexity of the proposed change. This idea is at the heart of all of the changes that we are proposing. Okay? And so they are broad. Governance is complicated. To sort of show you what this looks like in practice, we're going to go through each of the 5 types of FIPs that we are proposing, right? At the heart of this is the idea that different FIPs require different things, and that is really what we're trying to parse and then put back together for a more robust FIPS process overall. So the first kind of FIP that we want to consider and build processes for are FRCs, Filecoin requests for comments. These are non-consensus dependent standards, very, very common. We actually have about 20 of them right now that are active, that have been published. And the threshold for these in terms of review and maintenance and consensus is next to 0. These are things that anyone can publish. If you have ever worked or participated in the Ethereum community, Ethereum has hundreds and hundreds of these. Other open source ecosystems have thousands, right? These are the things that effectively glued together the early web and continue to be referenced. And for Filecoin, we want it to be the same. Standards indicate things that we as the community think are best practices. They allow us to signal them more broadly and then test them over time. And we don't really want to change the way we're managing these. Anyone can open a PR, say that they have a request for comment, folks will comment and review, and we accept them into the repo and maintain them over time. No changes. We want clear documentation, but that is always a work in progress and always a goal. Questions? Ideas? All right. Also, they said to make it fun, so I added this emoji, and I hope you like it. Okay, cool. It is very funny, thank you. All right, next, technical FIPs. So, technical FIPs are, I would say, roughly, and this is an estimate, which I specify because someone will probably count and check me. This is 95% of the FIPs that we get, and we'll probably continue to get. These are the FIPs that represent core changes to the Filecoin protocol, and we really don't want to make any changes to this process either. These are the types of FIPs that soft consensus, right? Our mechanism of deciding what gets accepted or rejected currently was really designed to facilitate, right? The threshold on soft consensus is really high. And it's because these kinds of proposals, they are non-controversial, so to speak. Yeah. Yeah, great question. So soft consensus is something that we use. It's also an open source standard in a lot of communities that really kind of implies to the feel of the room. It's this sort of squishy metric that says we know what people want, and that is what we're going to use to make our decision. It is the sense that everyone more or less is in agreement. No one really has any major points of opposition, and if that's the case, then we're going to move forward. This is why the bar is really, really high, right? There is an obvious challenge here, and it's that if one person or a group of people very clearly objects to something, well, we don't really move forward with it. Until we can sort of remediate the disagreement or the conflict, it's very challenging to say that we have general consensus, and those types of FIPs we tend not to consider accepted or ready for implementation. Most technical FIPs, though, that is actually not the case. We have a standard that we have been managing for about the last year and a half, which is that if you object to a technical FIP, you have to object substantively. The FIP author has to be able to engage in remediating your concern or objections. And you also have to act in good faith when objecting, right? And yes, it is a very high bar, and yet we've seen that it works pretty well for most FIPs. The trade-off with soft consensus, and I'll come back to you in just a second, is that yes, it's kind of this squishy, human-centered process, but it also allows us to develop really rapidly. And for a protocol as complicated, technically, as Filecoin can be, this type of process is really, really helpful because it allows us to signal and document changes and decisions as they are made in a very public way, while also allowing us to move very quickly through highly technical changes that, frankly, a lot of people in the Filecoin community either are unable to due to expertise or technical barriers, or simply don't want to engage with, right? And this is also what we saw in the very early days of Filecoin, where we're shipping rapid changes and some of them just look like routine maintenance. Yeah, do you have a question?
Yeah. What are the channels that are used by the community to express concern about a FIP once it's published? And what are the channels that the author can use to remediate those?
Yeah, so ideally those channels are the exact same. So authors and community members who are engaging with the FIP are communicating in the same places. And right now, for better or for poorer, the primary place that we point people to, is GitHub. So we require that when you are working on a FIP draft, if you have opened a PR, you must have a corresponding discussion post, and that is where we try and capture all of the primary feedback related to that proposal. Obviously, folks also talk on Slack. They used to talk on Reddit. It's less popular now. We also have lots of sort of async forums that we use, meeting forums. So community calls, working group meetings, etc. Almost all of those are recorded, but they don't facilitate much conversation. The benefit of using GitHub is not just because that's where we have all of our PRs and code base, but also that it allows us to capture conversations over time and also to return to issues. And so it's been pretty robust for what we need it for.
I'm noticing we're kind of modeling after Mozilla IETF. Can I ask like Dietrich and Robin, who have experience with those, to like just say how this works in those and the pros and cons of that?
How much time do you got? I mean, I'll let Robin speak to the broader W3C. And one of the challenges, because most of my participation was through Mozilla as a single party in this multi-party, not managing the actual overall process. Whereas Robin's time at W3C was more the conductor and orchestrator of many, many stakeholders, having many, many of these types of processes all running in parallel. And you could probably describe that landscape better. But for Mozilla as a, I guess, customer of a participant in these types of things, it was a long process. And I think that speaks to what Kaitlin's talking about in some of this, was like these are very long running processes that mature over time, and that there's no like magic silver bullet. but very clear and explicit ways of articulating and formulating how those stakeholders' voices are represented are really key, and that, I think, is what we're hearing about here. Yes, like small changes in CSS might take 7 years to yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean it's. I mean, there's several things in terms of timing. I think one of the difficulties with consensus is that it takes time to build the culture that goes with it. Because it's soft and because it's not some kind of like strict, clear, super step-by-step process. You need to build expectations about how conversations happen. You need to drill into people that the sentence "I can live with it" is perhaps the most important sentence they will ever utter. Things like that take time to build. And conversely, there is at a longer time scale, the problem with consensus is it tends to solidify. And so this is not an immediate problem, and maybe it won't be a problem by the time it becomes one, but there is a moment at which consensus cultures tend to create very stable conditions such that you no longer get strong evolution when you need it. And that is something we need to like sort of needle the community once in a while to jot them awake. But I don't think that's a problem right now.
No. Not exactly.
I guess like I was going to say something earlier, but like that's my biggest concern, Kaitlin, is like I'm on the business side of things, so that point of view, but like for Filecoin to evolve into a very competitive cloud storage platform, and a platform for things broader than that, I think the speed at which like we can evaluate changes and reactions to market conditions and reactions to competitive landscape and things like that has to be faster than like a 7-year like small change or something.
Right.
And so I think this is going okay now because the folks engaging on these types of FIPs are pretty paged in and I think pretty responsive. I don't know if you have like an average time to maturity for this kind of FIPs or something.
We don't in these slides, but we did this analysis just a few weeks ago, and the average time to engagement for FIP editors is about 1 day, which is a really fast turnaround, actually.
And time to
do an initial review.
self-consensus?
Oh, no, sorry. When we first start working on the draft, but time to soft consensus, we've had FIPs that have been open as drafts for 2 years, and we'll get an author that pushes some changes to them. Right as we're about to close it for an activity, that's when they push. And over months and months and months, it can be really slow. And usually when we get quick FIPs, so to speak, that speed is not informed by what I think is a best practice as far as the development of cultural standards and norms goes. So oftentimes what we'll see is we say, hey, we've scheduled a network upgrade, right? And all of a sudden people will say, oh, actually, I want this change to be made because I want to work on something in 6 months and it requires a change to the storage market actor, and so I'm going to have to push this FIP now. That is not a good practice for supporting a soft consensus process long term because it couples technical implementation and governance in ways that don't mutually reinforce each other. And it also kind of speaks to this idea of core contributors or those who have sort of the special expertise to participate in this process, having an advantage over others because they know how to navigate this process really efficiently. And again, that's not really a very fair standard for people to have to participate in. Does that make sense?
I guess like the point I'm making, which I don't have any solutions, so it's not that helpful, is like, I think our community has to get into the mindset of being able to enact changes on a faster time scale than some of the other examples, listed here, because like it's a competitive landscape and we're trying to maneuver our way into product market fit as a community that like is going to take, especially in the early years, like a lot more rapid change. And so it scares me when, we pick a type of governance model that like by default has like speed as a downside, I guess, right?
But
But I don't have a better answer either, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me just add to that because there's also quite a bit of diversity on the organizations there. I mean, the question that you asked like, if you look at the W3C or ITF, they're actually fairly agile when compared to traditional standards organizations, right? So I'm way more familiar with, yeah. So IEEE and like IEEE does not use soft consensus, the IEEE Standards Association. There is a lot of soft consensus on the development of the text, right? But then you have
Yeah.
balloting, and the balloting not only requires a 75% majority approval, but it requires 75% participation. So if there's abstention, the ballot will not pass, right? So, sorry? Well, it's members of the specific working group so there's no absolute number. It might be 10 people. It depends on the scope of the standards, right? Then it goes to approval by the Standards Association board, but that's almost rubber stamping for most cases, and that is a large membership. But that's not the critical part, right? But from the people that are involved in a certain working group or in a certain topic, there is approval, formal approval required and you need to have a majority of people participating, which we don't. I mean, generally speaking,
Yep.
we have the absence of complaints, but we don't generally get that sort of affirmative action. Let's put it that way. But I agree entirely with what you said, Colin. I mean, I don't think these are good examples. I mean, we cannot have 7-year cycles. That said, I mean, we also need to be careful about how agile we want to be, because for some technical FIPs, I mean, these are, core consensus changes that if we mess them up, it might not be, we might not come back from that, right? So we also don't want to be too casual about it, but we need to make decisions quickly and efficiently, of course.
Yeah.
I think in terms of figuring out ways of being fast with a consensus process, a lot of it comes down to culture and expectations. And so, for CSS, I mean, yeah, CSS is terrible at that there because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you have rounded corners or not, right?
Yep.
There's the pressure to actually have rounded corners solved is like, developers are not happy, but they'll figure something out, right? Whereas I think in this case, it's kind of a do or die situation. And I think that's much easier to explain to the community. And it's easier to prevent people from bike shedding forever on tiny details. You can like step in and talk to people and go like, look, we need to decide this within, the next 2 months. Otherwise, there won't be anything to decide about. So it's possible to have that communication and to bring consensus about how fast to do consensus. There are also forcing functions. So sometimes things that require speedy action are because there's a change in the community that uses something. And so that's happened for web standards quite a few times. When mobile happened, none of the existing structures were able to cope with it because most of the members didn't even believe mobile was part of the web. And so the way you change that is you basically force that new community to communicate and to be very present in the process. And the way W3C did that is that they had a mobile web initiative where they basically dragged operators in, and everyone sort of had this epiphany moment where they're like, oh, actually, these people are doing real solid work. They're not just crooks trying to sell us overpriced SMSs. And so there are ways of dealing with that. None of them are like super strict and clear, but in terms of community management, we can figure out ways of accelerating processes when there's a need for it.
Yeah.
I think as a cultural way to accelerate it, one thing that we've seen in web standards process is pre-flighting that diversity of ideas before it gets to something like a critical vote. So like things like the WICG, this incubator group, is a place where people can propose these very different ideas before it gets to the point where you have the whole community decide. And that you get this kind of a triage earlier on.
Yep. Yeah.
And Kaitlin's done an awesome job with that in the, I forget what it's called, but it's like a FIP discussion or before a FIP.
Yeah. The forum or discussion posts.
Right. I'll move on because I know you have a lot more to cover. But like one thing that would be helpful for me, Kaitlin, this is like I'm saying my perspective, right? But I would love maybe in some of the when you're talking about this process and gathering input, maybe you have like some question that you ask different stakeholders in the network, like, okay, if it's like 1 day to like 10 years on like when changes happen and you put all these organizations on some plot, where would you want technical FIPs or Filecoin governance to be? It's like maybe SPs are like, hey, I made investment decisions based on a certain protocol, and I don't want things to change. Like I'm talking about it from like a very narrow lens as like
Sure.
kind of an ecosystem person, you know. But I think it might be good to like play that feedback back in these types of presentations and say, okay, even if we're going with like soft consensus as a mechanism, the community expects us to move way faster than IETF or Ethereum. And hence, like,
Yep.
we need to conform to that. You know what I mean?
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, so I really hear your concern. And I think this is when we talked about these like key assumptions and all of the things that we've kind of boiled down after all of the feedback like you're talking about. One of them is that Filecoin is dynamic. We have to make tough decisions. And timing is a huge component of this. So I think perhaps the focus on ideal timing is maybe a little misplaced, only because it varies. And sometimes there are FIPs that meaningfully can take a while, and they actually benefit from taking a while, right? People don't have a ton of time always, and when they can do reviews over a long period of time, we get better products. That's great. But there are also things, I'm thinking of FIP36, FIP56, two really complicated crypto economic proposals. They were fundamentally time-bound. These were things that we say, hey, we're trying to address a problem that we see happening, and this problem is going to happen in October or in January, right? There's an element of this that we can't simply just wait around, and if consensus is really fraught and we don't feel like we're near reaching it, how do we actually make that decision? And so I think the concerns that you're raising really speak to this balance of like, what is the trade-off between having a low changeability, very consistent environment that investors, that storage providers, that people participating in using Filecoin can depend upon to be reliable and stable over time, even as it is an open source project, right? With the expectation that Filecoin competes, that it actually moves forward when it needs to, and that in making the decision to do that, it is making decisions that are also good overall for the network, according to whatever function of good you think is important to be measuring, right? So there is a second, there are two sub-bullet points here that I think we should talk about also, which is this idea that soft consensus can work and it still has a place in this ecosystem for these kinds of FIPs. But we also know that there are kinds of FIPs that have different requirements. And so what we would like to do, and we're going to dedicate an additional portion of this day to talking about in greater detail, is we want to begin experimenting with on-chain voting for the kinds of proposals that we say, this is very time-bound, this is very network critical, and we need to move forward. And the idea here is, I mean, I vocally in other talks have been very opposed to the idea of moving away from soft consensus and introducing voting. It's very, very challenging, right? Voting systems are not silver bullets for making decisions. They are complex in ways that is not always readily apparent when you're kind of looking at the outputs of some really nice like user interface, right? But I think what we have gotten time and time again, and if you want to deep dive into some of the feedback we've gotten, I'd be more than happy to make that available, is that people want decisive choices in a time-bounded way for things that have time-bounded ramifications. And so what we would like to do is manage this change by optionally introducing this kind of voting as an available tool for us to use to run experiments with, while also keeping the pieces of soft consensus that work and continuing to try and build up that culture of contributing, of sort of iterative review and feedback, and of sort of opting into governing processes as well. Does that make sense or address your concerns? Do you have any follow-ups?
Yeah.
You're good? Yeah. For now? Okay. It's a lot. Okay, so with that, we bring to sort of the more challenging FIPs that we have in this ecosystem, right? So we talked about FRCs, standards, no real change to process there, really kind of low threshold. They don't require consensus, they don't require upgrades. They're signals and pieces of documentation. We had technical FIPs, which is most of our FIPs, right? Consensus bound, yes, but not always glamorous changes to the protocol stack. Sometimes that's not true. Sometimes, we have a lot of feedback and participation. We're going to introduce on-chain voting optionally to sort of help navigate those, to collect early data and see if there's a way for us to make quicker decisions when necessary. But how do we make decisions that are well-timed and appropriate for our most complex changes, right? And what we've identified is that the most complex changes, the places where we're getting the most feedback, and the places where we're having the most difficult time sort of building a culture of consensus, have to do with crypto economic and governance changes, right? These are changes that do not happen often, but when they need to happen, it is often very critical that changes do be made. And so the challenge for us is, again, talking about what Colin was suggesting earlier, about what is the appropriate rate of change. What we're trying to do is say these are types of FIPs that we're seeing emerge from the Filecoin community. They are especially complex because of the structure of changes that they seek to make. They tend to be really, really challenging to different segments of the Filecoin community. But we need to know decisively, yes or no, what we're going to do. And so what we would like to introduce is a little bit more of a complex consensus process, requiring voting for these changes, which are the most complicated to make, and then also relying on sort of the community capacity that we have to disperse expertise and also better inform the decisions that we're making, again, about some of our most critical choices. So for cryptoeconomic and governance FIPs, what we would like to see going forward is the requirement that community members vote, yes or no, whether they want to accept or reject the FIP. And again, that we empower a broader array of stakeholders in the Filecoin community, moving beyond just relying on core devs, but also keeping them part of this process, to have a more decentralized way of garnering expertise to inform community decisions as well. Okay? How are we going to do this? Well, we would like to do this, again, with voting, and also, again, this community guild idea of introducing this decentralized array of experts who can come together to inform and also contribute to voting on these particular changes. What this does is it moves us towards a bicameral governance system, which is quite common in lots of places, not just in certain open source projects, but also in governments, right? Having 2 points of feedback, one that can represent expertise, one that can signal appropriate decision-making, and one that can represent a broader array of diverse stakeholder opinions in a focused and funneled way, while also using community voting so that individuals are also allowed to express their preferences, and also that they're able to engage in a much lower layer way with the actual governance process itself. Talking about this as a change towards bicameral governance is technically true, but it also isn't really that much of a change if you look at the way Filecoin is governing currently, right? Where core devs, again, are playing a really foundational role in making choices for complicated FIPs already, but oftentimes in ways that were perhaps not intended or that core devs have signaled they're not interested in participating in. They are an expert body that is very visible, that the community trusts, and they also tend to be comprised of folks who know the protocol really well and have that innate expertise that we can use in order to assess and sort of navigate conversation as we're trying to achieve consensus. What we would like to do is simply say that there are other experts and elevate them in a more formal way. Question?
Yeah.
I think, is that Guy? I can't see you.
Yeah, that's me.
That guy?
How do you get experts to engage? How do you get the experts to actually engage?
Yeah, good question. So practically, when we talk about like a community guild to help with governance, operationally, there's lots of ways. We want to tap existing working groups, right? So the storage provider working group, for example, is a really well-organized body of people who routinely come together. They hold open meetings and they signal a lot of preferences all of the time without having a formal role in governance. This is a group that we would like to provide sort of structure for, to say, hey, as long as you remain open, you allow new members to join, and the information that you're discussing, et cetera, you know, it's available in a repo, you open source standard, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Give some cultural norms and ask them to come to the table and say that if you're willing to do this, you get additional governing rights, yes? When it comes to actually motivating folks who currently have these roles, like FIP editors, core devs, et cetera, I think it goes back to what Robin was saying about, you know, it takes a while to develop the culture of participation that these communities really need. It's a hard thing to foster, but I think one of the best ways to sort of incentivize that, if you will, is to provide really clear pathways for folks to engage if they choose to do so, because oftentimes giving them the ability to do so is enough to inspire them to action, and that's what we'd like to see.
Yeah, quick question on like, so I better understand how this works procedurally, which you
Yep.
may be getting into. So sorry.
It's okay.
Like, so there are these two groups. You have like an expert constituency, whatever it's called, on certain areas, and then you have like the community sentiment.
Yep.
And like the way I read it, is in a couple previous slides is the expert constituency is the only one that has like veto kind of power, which isn't to say that like, and so veto just means the ability to say no, not the ability to say yes, right? So is it true, like from a crypto econ and governance perspective, if there is like wide agreement, consensus amongst like the expert core dev or whatever it may be called groups, but opposition from the general community that that policy change is not able to be implemented? Or is there another pathway by which, like, if there's, fairly large decision, like certainty amongst a group of experts that
Yep.
a policy is good for the network, but the communities may not want that? Like, how is that resolved? And if you're gonna get into that, then I don't want to derail it. But this is something that I wasn't able to come to the one in Singapore, so I'm glad I could come to this one, and
Yeah.
it's one I wanted to like understand better.
Yeah, so we want to dedicate like a full 45 minutes to talking about just this after this intro session. If others, I mean, this is a small group. If you feel like you really want to deep dive now, I welcome it. Thinking of the guild as having a veto function is actually a really good way of thinking about it. But ultimately what we want is just to create, I can show you in the slides as an example. Right, like a matrix like this, which looks confusing at first, but is relatively simple, except when it comes to actually deciding what the appropriate threshold is for that veto. The idea is, however, is if you have 7 experts from representing diverse opinions from across the Filecoin ecosystem, and they're all saying yes or they're all saying no for a proposed change, that is a very extreme type of consensus. It's unanimous. And that is the kind of decision that could override, if you will, like a vote, which could be split, etc. It should also go the other way, where if we have like high confidence in the polling that is happening within the Filecoin community, and we're looking at like a 90-10 split approving something, that should absolutely be a change which is made. It has to do with like finding thresholds in the middle that are appropriate, right? So you can think of having a voting tool as sort of community preference formation, a guild as sort of expert preference formation. We expect them, frankly, to be mostly aligned, since the tools we would like to build for voting roughly map with the same types of representation we think should be on this guild. But the most important thing is to make sure that in those marginal areas, maybe it's, 3 out of 7 on the guild say yes, and we have, 52% of the community say yes on a thing, that we're making the appropriate weighting choice about whether it should move forward or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, this is really clear. So it's not just like one way. So veto to me just means the ability to say no, but this matrix to me means it goes both ways. But it applies. But also this also means like communities can veto too, right? Like core or whatever it is, expert constituent group isn't the only one that can veto.
Yeah.
But it's not just veto; it's the ability to say yes too.
Yes, yes.
Okay, I just wanted to understand that better.
No, the idea of a veto is confusing because that's the correct way to think about it. You're right.
You're vetoing the saying of the no, I guess, is what that was just veto. So yes, so got it.
I think the correct framing is not that we want like a body of community experts to have veto authority over the community. We want both of these bodies to act as a check on each other, right? It's about creating a balance of authority so that we are able, again, to measure and move towards accountably good decisions, right? So again, where we're interested in seeing like divergence is at the margins, right? Everyone rejects, everyone accepts, or vice versa. And yeah, if you're looking again in those middle quadrants where there's a discussion to be had, this is just how I have modeled it. But those things obviously are very changeable.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm
George,
generally, God, this is really wild. I'm generally in agreement with the approach, right? But the one thing you notice in that table is that it's not symmetric, right? There's one cell that is non-symmetric.
Yep.
And so, I find that highly questionable. Even if we accept that the community guild has the best interests of everyone in mind and is extremely qualified to make those decisions, to issue an opinion.
Yep.
If you have something that 95% of the community accepts, which is within the threshold,
Sure.
It's very hard to say no to that because the community. I mean, if everyone's in agreement,
Sure.
like who can say no to it? I mean, like there's no effective way for you to enforce a different outcome. If the community agrees on doing something, they can do it. I mean, there's no mechanism to prevent them.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the most fundamental governing right you have in this kind of ecosystem is the ability to fork and the ability to leave. That will always remain true. If you're trying to follow, he's talking about the quadrant in the upper right-hand corner, which implies that you have this guild saying unanimous yes, and a community saying almost a unanimous no,
I
right?
think he's actually talking about the lower left-hand one.
Yeah,
Lower
talking
left?
about the lower,
The rejected
It's both.
when
Both?
It's the
You want to
fact
talk about both?
yeah, it's the fact that they're not symmetrical across the diagonal, right?
Right.
But yeah, but primarily the lower bottom corner, because that's the one. Like at that point, it's not no one's forking or leaving. Like you're forking because you're the like you're the 5% that doesn't want to
Right.
join. The community has made their decision at
Right.
that point.
Sure.
Yeah, I think, I mean, this gets into the next talk I think you're going to do, Kaitlin, but like,
Yep.
I think it's going to be really uncommon
Yeah.
to land in that quadrant
Yeah.
because you have a representative body where 0 of the expert representatives, and that means including representative from the SP working group, representative from the client working group, representative from like these groups
Yep.
who I would expect are bringing the perspective and knowledge from that domain to bear on this problem. Like, I just really struggle to come up with a scenario.
Yep.
Yeah, it would either mean that the mechanism is broken and that the folks in that community, like 0 of them think this is a good idea, but 75% of the people who chose to participate in this voting process do think it's a good idea, which means that there's like some sort of representation difference between those two groups, and then maybe we need to debug it. Or it means that there's some information disparity maybe between the two groups where they're acting on different information, and one group's like, hey, that's going to cause some major security issue, and they're like, I don't care, it's really nice, or I don't know. There's some discrepancy that's like a problem between them, and there is maybe a nudge that like rejection in that case is a more conservative option because something has gone wrong in our process and we should be figuring out what it is. But yes, like I just think that's going to be really unlikely, and that's less literally something is broken in our governance process.
Yeah.
I agree it's very unlikely, but there's precedent in other organizations. A good example, a good historical example to think about is DRM at the W3C. Where, I mean, the voting didn't break down exactly that way, but if they had been using that system at the time, it would have looked exactly like that. And so it happens every 10 to 15 years, but it does happen. So it's really good to be set up for it and to set the expectation well in advance. Yeah.
Give the example.
So the example was basically that browser vendors started wanting to support DRM on the web for video and audio because the alternative was that you'd had to use plugins. And that caused a problem because open source browsers then could not support DRM systems because the DRM has to be like completely closed. And therefore there was this compromise position of a bridge technology called EME that would bridge native web video to DRM systems that could be implemented in open source systems. And the idea from the W3C leadership was that that was a good compromise because a world in which Firefox cannot read Netflix is a bad world. But let's say opinions diverged in the community about that. Eventually it came down, so it was highly contentious. It was voted against and vetoed by various community level, elected groups. But the director of W3C overrode that and approved it.
I just, before we move over to Galen,
Voting as long as you decide what I think is right.
It's not that. It's like it's one of those difficult. I mean, this really is, I think, a difficult case because the W3C has no power to stop Google and Microsoft from doing DRM in their browsers, right? And so the question isn't so much is DRM good or bad? Is it possible for like Firefox and Brave and others to support to read these videos? or will they be excluded from, because like if users can't use their browser to go to like YouTube and Netflix, they're gonna drop the browser, right? And so the power that the organization has is not to forbid DRM, it's to decide whether that's a good compromise to bridge it that way. And so Tim decided that it was a good compromise and that people were voting against DRM and not against the compromise and overrode it. It's not something that happened often. I'm not expressing an opinion as to whether it's good or bad. I'm just giving it as an example of like, these are things that happen and that we should be ready for.
It also implies, right, that if you have these really marginal things that are happening, right, would happen, right, once maybe, what kind of forcing function do you need in order to resolve that conflict, right? I think this is what you're getting at. And George also, I mean, your point is very much heard, right? And if you want to look at any of like the furthest most 4 quadrants, right, but you look at them only as columns, you'll see that it is biased by me, who made this, right, towards the guild. Right? So in all of these extreme examples, if it is 7 out of 7 consensus to accept, we always accept. If it is 0 out of 7, we always reject. That is a subjective choice. And part of this process first comes in specifying the structures, right? And then modifying the rules and tweaking with the exact specifications in order to get a balance that is appropriate. And really having that conversation about what balance we think is best, right? And then actually collecting some data to see what outcomes are looking like and how we may need to move different curves depending on acceptance rates or our assessment of good choices being made, et cetera. That is, I think, going to be part of this process for a really long time. Galen?
So 2 questions around like the community vote. Members of the guilds
Yep.
are also potentially going to be voting in the community,
That's right.
right? And so I think that again creates what seems like an even further edge case where if the members of the guilds,
Yep.
are all opposed to something, they would also be voting. And it seems unlikely that a guild that is like around, a group of core devs or an implementation,
Right.
that the guild would fall one way, but then the individual members of that and their voting power as, token holders would say, I am voting to support this, even though the thing as an expert that I represent is going the other way. So I feel like getting to this bar where all of the members of the guild, but the community has such like 95%,
Yep.
seems even less likely. Is that accurate?
It is. And remember, too, that the purpose of the guild is to be representational, right?
Right.
So it is not just a single person saying, I have been voted to lead the storage providers, and this is my opinion. We want to input standards for reaching that consensus for them. So
Yeah.
your working group can figure out how it wants to corral its members. That is not my prerogative. But you have an obligation to make sure that the vote that you are casting, right, as part of this group, is in fact representational and that decision is accountable. That's the idea.
So then the second piece is around, again, this like community vote outcome.
Yep.
You talk about like 75% of the votes that are cast.
Yep.
But are there minimum thresholds? Like if we were to approach one of these
Yep.
and, a small percentage of people voted,
Yep.
but that very small percentage of voters went one way, is that also like baked into some of these like edge cases, making this matrix like?
You're talking about as like overall participation. So we have
Yeah.
to meet a minimum threshold for participation before a vote is valid,
Right.
right? Maybe we table this.
Okay, sorry.
No is the answer, with a million asterisked caveats, whatever. What I would suggest, looking at time, it's 11:17 now. We have until noon, and then we turn the floor to Filecoin Plus. There's one more slide related to these FIP types we'd love to get through. I would love to finish that up real quick. Everyone can take a 5 or 10 minute break if you want, grab some water, which I would also like to do. And then we can deep dive into whichever component piece of this or both is of greater interest, whether it's continuing to discuss the guild, its formation, sort of voting operations, or if you want to talk about on-chain voting, that's very welcome also. That's what we were going to use the second half of this for. Does that sound amenable? Is that good? Great. All right, 2 people voted, so we're going to say it's good. And I have the power, so, which we're trying to avoid long term. Okay. So last FIP type, our most complicated FIP type, security FIP. These are the kinds of things that propose immediate attack vectors to the network. They're problems that we identify, network-wide critical issues that need to be addressed. I say that there's no change for how we want to handle these procedurally, and that's partially true, in the sense that we actually just want to have a much more codified policy in place for these. We have never officially had a security FIP. We talk about it all the time and then realize that it's just a regular FIP, it's fine. What we want to make sure we're doing is ensuring that decisions are still accountable, even when there is an attack vector very imminent and present, right? So the idea here is to codify a pathway where, again, instead of just asking core devs to make a decision, which is a localized choice and also one that can carry a lot of ramifications, we use the guild, right? This is that dispersal we want, dispersing responsibility and decentralizing it across other expert bodies that are accountable and trusted within the community. To review, look at the draft, confirm that it is in fact a security FIP as claimed, that this is a zero-day threat to the network. It must be fixed. It cannot be disclosed beforehand. The change is made, and then all of the documentation for that, the decision-making, all of it is released ex post facto. Happy to discuss this if someone has ideas or concerns. But again, this is a model we've never used. We've talked about it. We have never really deeply considered what sort of the implications or policy should be here. And so really the only change we'd like to make is to just codify this more clearly should the situation ever arise. Molly, question?
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to flag, I think there might be two different kinds of security FIPs.
Oh, yeah.
Because at least in my observation from engaging
Sure.
in security-related changes at a network level, for example, A is like some of these are public and can be solved publicly and have low abuse ability, and some of these, which is I think what's being defined here, it's a 0-day, it could be abused and taken advantage of if it were widely disclosed, and therefore needs to be fixed quietly and then do responsible disclosure. And so those are two different situations.
Yeah.
Some examples in the first category of like can be resolved publicly are like, there's a chain halt. Like, we're not going to go through a long FIP review and writing and approval process. We're trying to figure out why the chain is halted and like get it back online.
Yep.
And I think, those are situations where you want to be, we've had exactly one chain halt in Filecoin's network life. We got it up in 4 hours. I think that's a massive like testament to the awesome humans who were monitoring, jumped on, like helped figure out what was going wrong and, deployed the fixes from a community perspective. And that's the sort of thing where like, I wouldn't want to add writing a FIP to the list of things that need to happen a priori, but it would be really good to document that and make sure that that lands and updates specs and, happens across many implementations and things like that. Other examples are things that are low likelihood of abuse in the meantime, where like the attack vectors, we can recognize it's a security FIP, that it's a problem if we hit XYZ security parameters,
Yep.
but that there's buffer against abusing that security vector.
Yep.
And so we definitely collectively as a community want to get that fixed and close that security vulnerability so that no one does take action against it.
Yep.
However, it maybe is a thing that we're doing proactively and we're not yet triggering the network. And those are ones where, I would like our FIP, our more defined security FIP process to be clear of how we handle those sorts of things, what sort of reporting, what sort of approval strategy, because the worst possible scenario for those, I would like us to be, hey, there's a security FIP, we think it's very low likelihood of abuse. However, if this suddenly started being abused as we go about fixing it, like we're going to have to do an emergency network upgrade to make sure that the solution hits the network in time to prevent that abuse taking effect or something like that.
Yep.
And that we can do that governance process openly and transparently as a community instead of pushing more things into the try and fix XYZ thing quietly, which I think is a worse state for us to be in as the network, where we're trying to make improvements and educate everyone about how we keep the network safe and in balance.
Totally. I think a good framing for this FIP in particular is what is the appropriate level of accountability for our decisions, right? And when we're making them, what is the appropriate level of visibility for them at the time they're being made? So I think what you're saying, Actually, no, I have a question for you. So when you talk about these instances of really imminent cause and effect, things like chain halts, this obviously would be the most immediate call to action, the thing which we have no time for drafting, approval, etc. Do you think that things which would qualify for that kind of special consideration, are they discrete things that, you know, if there are three things that could happen, and if these three things happen, then we're making the change immediately? Or do you think that it is a broader unknown?
It's a great question. Like we do have some defined parameters around
Yeah.
what we consider like a severity 1, severity 2, severity 0 issue, that would then be like calling all other implementations being like, hi, I know it's 3:00 in the morning, but like, oh my God, guys, we gotta like wake up and make some fixes. But I also always would want there to be like, you know, most likely it's one of 1, 2, and 3. It's most likely a chain halt. Someone is like draining funds from someone somewhere,
Yep.
or like maybe there's a third category. So it's most likely one of those three things, though we don't know how. But making some space for like,
Yeah.
you know, there might be something else that at the time that something like this gets written, so you know, FEM then lands and it's like, okay, cool, there's like a whole new vector where now you can like
Yeah.
remove people's deployed smart contracts or take over their smart contract and do something, I don't know, like that's a new attack vector that we might consider very high severity that would need to be patched ASAP, but that we don't necessarily predict a priori and put in that list that
Sure.
would also be.
Got it.
In some spaces, I've seen ways where they categorize those sevs as like a footprint. It's like a sev 0 is like, this will impact 100% of users or of activity or of, you know, funds. And then like, so they create space not saying like, oh, it's a chain halt, but saying this would, like a sev 2 would potentially be impacting, you know, 35% of the users. And so then it's like, okay, this is like a security issue because this band of people like could experience whatever the outage or threat or risk is. So then rather than needing to like understand the type of risk, it's what's the like footprint. And then you could then have a lot of flexibility of somebody showing up and saying, you know, this is a sev 1, like, and here's why.
Often there's an intersection between the two. It's both
Yeah.
scope of impact of like who can be affected by this and severity of impact of like how bad is it? Like, is it, for example, I think there was one where it's like, oh, you can't submit new sectors into the network right now. Like, whoops. And it's like, okay, well, that's not good. You know, everyone's affected and it will be a problem, you know, because we're not going to be able to be adding new capacity to the network. Definitely want to fix. But like, that's not as bad as like, great, now anyone can take anyone else's funds, or now anyone can slash anyone with impunity, regardless of whether or not they did a slashable offense. And like, those are much worse because they are corrupting like chain state and they are like corrupting the trust vectors in the network versus just not being able to utilize a new capability or existing capability.
I have been dealing with a lot of the incident in the Filecoin network and
Yeah.
dealing with the groups of people who participate in resolving the incident. Definitely, like a lot of people have different opinions, like what the severity of things, right? So like
Yeah.
I have my own opinion. It's like sev 0. I consider as like chain halt because like the network literally is like close to death, and that's in my book. That's the only sev 0 we have. In my personal book, there are sev 1, which is also very important. Our core functionality.
I would just posit, I think a chain halt is less bad than fund stealing. Because if the chain halts and the chain halts in, say, the way that it did in whatever it was, December 2020, you know, we just restart it. And look, how many times is the Solana chain halted? Like, sorry, maybe that's throwing shade. I don't mean to do that. I just mean like, of the bad things that can happen, that is not the worst. The worst is you've now corrupted chain state, you've taken funds, like the trust parameters of the network have been violated in like a painful and horrifying way. And so like availability is one factor, but personally I would put chain halt like lower than those.
I agree.
Like,
you,
sure.
you don't want DAO attack from 2016, and
Like-
then you need to do things. Yeah.
So my point is, everyone have different opinions. I think a good step right now is in a documentation. Like, I care a lot as one of the core implementers in the network. There's a guideline we follow on like when I can call people. I think the first time I talked to him in person, it's like I got his phone number. I was like, I don't know if this is you, but you work on Glyph. You run the nodes for the network.
Yeah.
We have an incident. Can you help me? It's very awkward, but like, you know, that's the situation we're dealing with. My point being, let's take a step at actually writing things down and make it like a standard public known. I think that's an action item we can take. I have been saying that for 3 years, as you know. But like, let's actually do that as a process of defining and document security FIPs, what they are. Back to Molly's point, is like, I can agree with you. I think there are two things to me. It's like we are a crypto-backed blockchain verifiable storage network. Crypto, the funds part, blockchain, keep the network lying part, and the functionality, we have to have verifiable storage. And those are the top three things in my list that have high severity in my head, right? So there are other things. For example, you used the example about like if EVM launched like earlier this year. Post-launch, we had 2 step 1 incident that people has to work around the clock, but there are API performance issues. Are they important? They are important because people cannot use the new functionality we deployed. Are they really step 1? Like, can they not wait for like 12 hours to solve, right? Like, different people have different opinions, but like, if we can actually set a guideline to people and align expectation across communities, implementers, so on and so forth, that would be super, super useful. There were stressful times. So that's my point. Let's write it down. I want to comment back on this particular thing. Like I have a hand earlier. I agree with like what Molly said is like there are different types of security FIPs. So like my point is here, the decision confirmed by the guild. From what I learned from Singapore is like the guild, including people like storage provider clients, like all the different network participants, right? There are certain security FIPs that could be having conflict interests with certain participants. It's like, I want to trust everyone has the best interest of the network here. However, some people are running a business, want to make money. If there's a loophole, they can dig into and exploit it. They possibly will be. So I'm just trying to say not everything can be publicly disclosed to everyone before we have a solution to mitigate, to close the security gap. So I want to be very careful when we say all the security FIPs has to make decisions confirmed by guild. That could be a potential risk.
Yep, that's a great point. I think this suggestion of having like tiers for different kinds of threat models is really useful. I think this is absolutely something that we can do. I think, from the governance perspective, the only thing to be aware of is this question of, in specifying different tiers, if we look at the lowest risk tier, still making sure we can justify that this is enough of a threat model for us to have special privileges in making this change. I think that's always where we need to be most wary. Similar with, it's similar also to saying, okay, well, we have crypto econ FIPs. Well, everything is crypto economic in a crypto network, right? Making sure that we are appropriately specifying things. Part of this comes just from precedence and then practicing using these terms and making sure we're making good judgment calls that are documented and accountable. It's one of those things that takes a little bit of time, but I think that is going to be sort of the litmus test that we can use to make sure that we're specifying these correctly, at least at first. But if we think we'd make a mistake, it's okay, because we want to create pathways. Which way am I moving?
We want to hear George.
No, I
think
Ayush was first.
For governance, probably. For governance changes, is what I say. Yeah, Ayush?
Yeah, so I think this generally sounds good. I do think this is a little overdue. It's, we've never had to do it, but this is very much the kind of thing of like, let's write it down, let's maybe even over-specify, and so that when there's an incident, okay, we can, and if we do have to do something, privately, whereas today every FIP is very loudly in public as best as we can, we can at least point to it and say, look, this is an example of whatever, an attack where you could slash every miner, and that's why we fixed it privately, and now here's our disclosure, and I think that'll just be a lot cleaner. And I'm happy to work with you to specify. I think overspecification is good here to specify as many possible, incidents that, or events that we would consider a security FIP.
Yep.
There's one that's not clear to me, and this might be a little controversial, which is what do we do if there's nothing, if the bug doesn't exist with the protocol or anything in the implementation, or you can't crash a node, but instead with something important that's deployed on the network. And honestly, the DAO is a great example of that. There was nothing wrong with Ethereum. There was nothing wrong with the EVM. There was just a bug in a contract, but an important contract. Filecoin now has that possibility as of March 14th. And it might be a good idea for us to at least think about that and maybe establish some precedent or some stated policy about how we would react in that situation, even if it'll ultimately be a case-by-case situation. I don't have a personal opinion on what we should do in that case.
Was it you or me?
I don't know, but if you let me. All right. So, I mean, 2 points on this. One is that, to what Jen said, I don't think, like, the requirements for not sharing something with the guild should be extremely high. I don't see sharing with the guild as being the same as sharing with the public, right? The whole point of the guild is that we have trusted representatives, trusted being the keyword, and so the trusted representative of the clients or the storage providers or something, there's an assumption that if we're sharing a security incident with them, they're not going to go and share it with everyone, because otherwise that defeats the purpose of having the guild involved in the process, right? So I think, that needs to be very clear in the expectations set for participation on this in this group. That's point number one. Point number two is more like, I think we often sort of mix together severity and urgency, right? And that's not only not the same, but it leads to very different outcomes in terms of security FIPs. Anything that is urgent and that requires an off-schedule upgrade will be disclosed. I mean, you can keep it secret for 5 days while you work on the fix, but when you ask people to do an emergency upgrade, like, you need to explain why, right? The only things that you can actually do and retroactively explain are things that go into a scheduled upgrade, so you are aware of an issue that no one else is aware of, so you sweep it in, and then eventually you disclose it. Oh, by the way, in that upgrade, we also fixed this issue, right? So these are very different workflows.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in that version of a security upgrade, an emergency security upgrade, you aren't following the FIP process of, 2-week last call process and this, that, and the other thing. Like, the disclosure of the issue happens very close to the point of the upgrade, like about at the time the code is published, with maybe 24 hours until an upgrade, because you're trying to minimize the exploitation window. And so I do think that it's good to have documented the policy, because like that is not compliant with what I think is a good notification policy in general. I wanted to go back to the guild notification thing, because I think that put some design constraints on the guild, because I think the way we've been talking about this so far is like, there are these 7 votes. It wasn't quite clear to me that it's like literally 7 individuals that are effectively like elected representative individuals versus a voting process or a decision-making process that is defined by that. If there's not an individual, who do you notify in this context? How do you have their emergency contact information to be able to wake them up in the middle of the night when there's a thing that they need to review? And who is that? How do you get in contact with them? The second point is, I think the current model for the guild is it's trusted by whatever process it represents its stakeholders, not necessarily that every member of the guild trusts each other, and that there's some it would be more like, great, I'm definitely acting in the best interest of my stakeholder group, but maybe not the best interest of other stakeholder groups in the ecosystem. And so I would love it if we could have strong trust within that guild. If we're leaving the decision-making process of how any one of those groups makes decisions or elects people or something, then I don't know if you can count on that and rely on that level of, say, discretion and, not exploiting an issue that they learn about, in advance of others or something like that. Like, I would love to have that level of trust, but I don't know if it's baked into the selection and evaluation process of choosing those experts right now.
The version I heard in Singapore, in Singapore, for example, storage provider as a part of the guild, it's the storage provider working group. It's the whole set of the people, right? So like, while we are saying we're gonna trust them and tell them like, disclose everything with them like in advance, it's a large group of people, because right now we already have over 50 storage provider working group members. It's possible that grow into 100,
But
right?
I don't think that's not going to be viable. Like feasibly,
Right.
ain't nobody gonna call 50 different people in the midst of like a major security incident and like get all of them to like sit down and have one of their meetings and like agree or disagree and et cetera, et cetera. Like technically, I don't think that's feasible. And also from a security perspective, I don't think it's feasible to widen the reins on a very significant 0-day sort of vulnerability that could be exploited. And so I think
Right.
these are interesting design constraints on what the guild structure itself might look like if this is here, or maybe we need some, like, I don't know, maybe the way that a decision is confirmed by the guild is going to need to look a certain way for different kinds of security FIPs. Like, I think from hey, here's a thing that is going to get fixed in the future. Like, I think people would be relatively willing to publish that as a FIP, where it's like, this is a security FIP. It needs to be fixed as a security FIP. Like, these are the conditions by which we will accelerate a release of this security FIP if we start to see it being abused in the network.
Yep.
But we would like to not waste everyone's time and not create a lot of additional overhead and fix this in normal operations. But here are the circumstances in which we can't, in which case the guild is getting visibility and has maybe some, yes, that seems like a security issue, sort of like input that they could give, but
Yep.
there's actually public, open visibility into like what the issue is and how it's planning to be solved.
Yep.
But then in the more like 0-day situation, there's a bit more of a question here of like what level of
Right.
of detailed notification is required for the guild, and what sort of checks and balances are we putting on that participation?
Yep. So I want to quickly touch on a couple of things you said, and then maybe we can transition a bit more away from security FIP specifically. So yes, there are some very clear constraints, which is helpful. And then there's also a lot of design modes that we can also choose for this. It could be in the future that guild members are, elected randomly. They could be done so on chain. It could be a randomization process. There could be formal elections. They can do whatever they want. Maybe they don't know who each other are, right? It could also be that the decision they're confirming, right, is one in which we say, hey, we have a FIP written, we have a problem, here is the identified solution and the design pathway for it. Do you agree that this is an emergency? Or, right, that the framing of the actual question posed to them should be part of sort of the documented governance process by which these decisions are made. It may not be for them to have as active of a role as we have asked core devs to play in the past, simply because core devs is a body of technical experts and this will not be. And there can be conflicts of interest, right? But I want to also touch on, you said very briefly, like, there cannot be trust between members because members may be representing different interests.
I'm just saying there's not necessarily trust
Sure.
between.
Yeah, not necessarily. Ideally, people would professionally trust each other to make best informed choices. It's the goal, in fact, I would say. But I think one of the things that's really important about creating a structure like this is that it actually gives space for individuals to very clearly represent an interest group in a way that is accountable, which is something that we have a really hard time with now, right? Filecoin is growing. We still have a very select core group of contributors who've been in this ecosystem for a long time. That is a good thing. That is great institutional knowledge. If I can, Molly, you're one of these people. And there are many instances where you have to speak to different stakeholder groups and to different interest groups as one person. Part of the capacity building that we want to do within the Filecoin community is not just decentralizing trusted expertise, but it's also creating space where it is very, very clear what role and what perspective people are adopting in the decision-making process. This is something that does reinforce trust because we understand what assumptions and biases people have at face value, and those assumptions and biases are appropriate in their context. And it helps unblock one of the biggest challenges we have now, which is making appropriate, difficult decisions in a way that is fair and balanced, Because in the past, again, we haven't had different outlets for different perspectives to be accounted for in a really critical and impactful way. We're in this position of a lot of core contributors feeling like they need to represent multiple interest groups at the same time, and it leads to this diffusion of responsibility that's very, very hard to get around. So I think it was a small point, but I think it's my favorite one that you called attention to. Sorry, Galen. It is 11:43. If we could, I would love to take like a 5-minute break, 10-minute break, and then we'll finish up. It'd be great to, again, review what we have. If there's any other big questions or topic areas that anyone wants to call attention to specifically, totally welcome it. We'll probably have like 30 minutes where we can really deep dive on one specific thing. I ask that it not be security FIPs unless everyone else wants it to be security FIPs. But my personal opinion would be talking a little bit more about on-chain voting, which is something that has curiously gone by the wayside during this conversation. That said, before I leave you, table, what do all of these things look like together? They look like this. This chart has been published for a very long time. 5 different types of FIPs, breaking them out. They may have subsections like security FIPs. Technical FIPs might have different pathways people can choose between, but really making sure and paying attention to the fact that the very beginning part of this process doesn't actually change at all. A lot of this will be very continuous from what we have now, which is the goal. Nope. What's next? So we have always been on track. October 15th, Filecoin's 3rd birthday. This is the date by which we will have the PR for FIP1. I ask that you support it. You may even get it sooner, actually. It's like mostly drafted, and now we will incorporate your feedback. It will be available. We hope to push it through soft consensus. It's why we've been talking about this for such a long time and getting everyone's feedback and making sure that their needs are well represented. But if you, after this session today, would like to keep talking about this, which I highly encourage, you can text me or call me, or you can join our community governance calls. We pushed one out specifically so that folks here can join if they wish to. I made this QR code. You can scan it and you can register for our meetings. You will automatically be registered for all of them. They happen on a monthly basis. We have a Slack channel. You can go comment on the discussion forum on GitHub, which is where we've been documenting all of these things. There's lots and lots of places, but if you leave this room today and you realize after the fact that you have additional ideas, concerns, something doesn't sit right with you, you have a question about something, please raise it. The more public, the better. Others may share the same idea or concern. And truly, the whole idea here is to make sure that we end up with a governance system that really works really well for everyone. Please, give me your ideas. They're all good. Okay. Can I add?
I have a critical question about this one. And Kaitlin, are you actually going to have a governance meeting on December 25th at 10 p.m. or sorry, 8 p.m.?
Yeah, and Santa will be there too, so you should come.
Fun. Okay. Christmas party, everybody, with Kaitlin and the governance team. Good
Yeah.
fun.
You get a gift. Not from me, but I'm sure someone will bring them. Yeah, governance is a gift, and you all are welcome. Yeah. Okay. It is 11:46. I really personally just need some water. So if we could reconvene by 11:55, and then again, use some of our remaining 30 minutes to talk about voting, that would be wonderful. And also, thank you all. It's been 2 hours of participation, and I do really appreciate it. So thank you for joining our session so far. And see you in 5 minutes.